look how big I am. Huge. There we go. Haha. And let's see, today we're starting the skeleton. Okay, let me let some people in here. Okay. So we've got a couple of minutes. Well, I'll wait till everybody gets here. How about that? Mm-hmm. 17, 18. Look, you have company today. Poor thing, she was all by herself Tuesday. Oh, it's wet? Oh, I wonder if it dripped. Huh, there's always something going on in this room. You look at the poor ceiling, it's all stained. It's right above us is the stock room in the second floor. Okay, anyway, it's 11 o'clock, so it's time to get started. Today's Thursday, February 11th, 2021. And you guys are biology 1160 section 2, my Tuesday, Thursday section. And last time let's see, we finished up the skin. So that was all the material for your first exam, which is a week from today. And it's gonna be Thursday of next week. And then we also started and completed the first PowerPoint on bone, right? And so now we're doing our second of 3 PowerPoints, the skeletal system. And so here we are. Let me get this started. And we're gonna change my view here a second. And let me get the lights real quick. That looks better. Good. Let me see this right here. I'm going to scoot this down a little bit. I guess that's as far down as I can get it. Anyway, the skeleton. Look at my first slide here. I put this together. I build my own PowerPoints, slide by slide, picture by picture, text by text. So, it's not something that was manufactured by some book company. So some of them look kind of homemade and hokey. It's my fault. But when doing this PowerPoint, I was thinking like, what would be a good first slide? We'll talk about the etymology of the word skeleton. It literally means mummy, or it refers to the same thing. Originally, a skeleton and a mummy were the same thing. But if you look at a mummy, like they would find in the pyramids of Egypt or whatever, this is, I think everybody's seen a mummy before. It's a dried up, desiccated human remains. And basically what the form you see is just the collection of bones, the skeleton. And so this is my first slide. Look at that poor individual there in the middle. Well, what is it? Well, we actually, remember we're talking about body systems, and the skeletal system is one of our body systems. And it's comprised of organs, and of course the organs in the skeletal system are the bones. And so, like everything else in this course, and pretty much in biology, or maybe science in general, we like to categorize and classify and group things, so we do the same thing to the skeleton. So let me find my pointer here. I think, let's see, I think that's it right there. Divisions of the skeleton. There's the human skeleton consists of 206 bones. In other words, 206. I always talk about that. Is it 206 or is it 212? Well, in this course, how I teach this course, 206 named bones. The remaining 6 that you feel like you're getting cheated. So what are those other 6 bones? Well, we'll see when we do the special senses, and we're going to talk about the ear. There are 3 pairs of auditory ossicles associated with the ears. And so those are your extra 6, right? So we'll talk about them when we talk about the ear. But as far as the human skeleton, this is pretty standard for all mammals. It's a human skeleton is a typical mammalian skeleton. Okay, and that's how we're going to address it. Now, let's see. All the bones, you see this illustration I have here. See how it's kind of color coordinated? It's got blue and kind of bone colored. There's two parts to it. All the bones are either classified as axial or appendicular. We have had this verbiage before, axial and appendicular, when we're talking about body regions. It's not exactly the same thing for the skeleton. Of course, there is some overlap, but it's not region for region and bone for bone the same. So there are some differences. But basically, you have an axial and appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton, that's 80 of the 206 bones, include the bones of the skull. And when we study the skull, we'll see that the skull itself is a skeleton. It's actually called the cranial skeleton. It's going to be comprised of 22 separate bones that come together to form this bony collection. Okay. Anyway, all the bones of the skull, all the vertebrae. Now you're going to have different types of vertebrae. Some of them are going to articulate. Some of them are going to be fused, and so on and so forth. But basically, just a downward extension of the skull, all the vertebrae, and then all the ribs, which are attached to the vertebrae. And then I throw you kind of like a curveball here. Usually the sternal bones in the human anatomy, see the sternum, your breastbone, because I teach other anatomy courses. Okay, I'm a vertebrate anatomist or vertebrate zoologist by training, and that's how I guess you can say I'm qualified to teach human anatomy, because I teach the anatomy of all kind of other critters, of all the vertebrates, everything with a backbone, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and all the mammals. I do all that. And humans, eyes are nothing more than just another mammal. But in other courses, we group bones a little bit differently. And in one course in particular, when I talk about the evolution of the skeleton, the sternum and the sternal bones, there's two camps of thought, two schools of thought. It's axial or appendicular. In this class, I'm just going with what your author argues, or doesn't really argue, just states the sternum, it's axial, case closed, doesn't really talk about it. But when you get into a more advanced anatomy course, like I would teach, we talk about some other things. And so we argue that it's in fact appendicular. So, but anyway, in this class, what you need to know is that it's axial. And you look, it's colored the same as the ribs. And so, hey, we're gonna leave it axial just like that. But if you're curious about that, then ask me sometime, and I can bore you with all kinds of evolutionary history of the skeleton and the pectoral girdle and so forth. But anyway, so axial bones, and then there's parts to the sternum we're going to talk about. Everything else, all the blue bones you can see are appendicular. Now, when we talked about appendages, right? The appendicular regions, remember all that? That's basically what you have, or the remaining 126 bones of the appendages, which includes the girdles. And this is where you get some overlap, because we didn't really, when we talked about the girdles in the regions, the girdles are actually part of the body's axis. But when we look at the skeleton, the girdles are actually a part of the appendages, because the girdles are what attach the appendages to the axis. So you have a pectoral girdle, pectoral region, and then the pelvic girdle in the pelvic region. And you can see, it's all blue, and then down here it's all blue. And so basically all the bone color stuff is just axial, 80 bones, and then the 126 appendicular bones. And we'll talk about all of them, okay? So now, before we get into it, I'm going to give you a little background on bone shapes that we identify. And we classify bones in all the bones as they fall into one of these four categories based on their morphology. Bones have four shapes. First, there are long bones. And we talked about long bones already here, the last PowerPoint, when we talked about the structure of a bone, structure of a long bone. But not all bones are like that. But what makes a long bone a long bone? Well, they're long. They're longer than they're wide. But the kicker is that they have a diaphysis and two epiphyses. Not all bones are arranged like that. But if they do have a diaphysis and two epiphyses, it's a long bone. These are the bones that are typical of your limbs. Everything from the girdles on out, excluding the bones of your wrist and ankles. So that the tarsal bones and the carpal bones, which are technically part of the limbs, would not be considered long bones. Okay? Well, what are they considered? I know you're asking yourself that question, and I'm going to tell you. Number two, those are short bones. Short, I describe them as being roughly cube-shaped. Now, don't call them cuboidal bones. There's no such thing as a cuboidal bone or a class of cuboidal bones. They're called short bones. Those are the bones of the wrist and the ankle, because they're kind of, well, cube shape, I guess. They don't have a diaphysis and epiphyses and something like that. They form basically from their own ossification center. Okay, so there they go. It's pretty easy. Just think, wrist, ankle bones, all your tarsals and all your carpals. Okay. Number three are flat bones, because they look flat. Thin and flat includes the sternal bones. This is the sternum, and we'll see that there's three elements that form the sternum, and we'll talk about that. All your ribs are considered flat bones. Now, the ribs are kind of long. They might seem kind of like a long bone, but they're not. They're flat bones because they don't have epiphyses and so forth. Your scapula, your shoulder blade, is a flat bone. Your clavicle, that's your collarbone. It's also considered a flat bone. And then I have most of the cranial bones. Because we're going to see when we study the skull, there's a bunch of different bones in the skull, and some of them are classified as flat, and then others are irregular. Usually the flat ones are the ones that are making up the brain case, and usually the ones that are making up the face are going to be irregular bones. But we'll talk about that. And so what's number 4? Well, like I just said, irregular bones. That's remember we always had this junk drawer of classification. I always talk about that, my junk drawer. Remember splincology and what was another junk drawer I had? The endocrine-like organs, remember that? All these classification schemes that I've come up with or share with you. And then there's things that are in the grouping, part of the grouping, that don't really fit cleanly into a group. So we just kind of throw them all into this junk drawer. So number 4, irregular bones. Those are all the other bones that are not flat or short or long, just the other ones that have weird shapes. Here are the bones with complex, irregular shapes, like your vertebrae, all your vertebrae. We can see there's 26 different articulating vertebrae and then a number of fused vertebrae, but they're all considered irregular bones. The bones of the pelvis, and then the other cranial bones and some of the facial bones. Those are, of course, bones of the skull. They're considered irregular bones. And we'll identify them when we come across them, okay? So there's that. Now for some special bones. And they're special because they're like in their own class. They're their own unique things. And when I say 206 bones, 212 bones, you say you name them, add them up and stuff. But not every human skeleton has the exact same number of bones. There are 206 bones that everybody has, and those are the ones that we identify and name when we talk about the name bones of the skeleton. But there are other bones outside of that in your skeleton, okay? Some of them are a part of the skeleton, some of them are not. Now, when we talked about bony tissue, remember osseous connective tissue? Sometimes you have osseous connective tissue that develops or fortifies other tissues. And so it's really not part of the skeleton. It's just there. You have bone that appears there. And this tissue, osseous connective tissue, might appear here, there for one reason or another. Sometimes it's included with the skeleton and sometimes it's not. Most often it's not. Now there is a class of bone like that called sesamoid bones, and sesamoid bones, I tell you, are a unique example of short bones because they usually occur from their own ossification center, and they're kind of cube shape. Basically, they're not long, they're not flat. They're just kind of like a hunk of bone that develops somewhere. They are the short bones that develop within tendons for reinforcement. And you can see right here, this is your knee, or somebody's knee anyway. These are the quadricep muscles up here. There's the kneecap right there, and you can see the quadricep tendon coming down across the knee and then inserting on the tibia down here. And so right here, just all this big tendon right there, all tendon, and all of a sudden, bam, you have a bone in the tendon. What's up with that? That's not really part of the skeleton. It's really not forming a joint with another bone. It's not articulating with another bone. And that's true. So it's kind of a kind of disjunct bone, disjointed, it's not really part of the skeleton, it's in tissue. But we include certain ones in our skeleton, and I talk about that. There are many in your body. There are many sesamoid bones throughout the body, but they tend to be very small and asymmetrical and insignificant. And due to that, we don't include them. The only sesamoid bones included in the 206 human bones are the patellae, that's your kneecaps, and the episiforms, and that's the episiform. Those are your some wrist bones, some carpal bones that they develop in a tendon in your wrist, pisiforms, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the carpal bones. These are the only sesamoid bones that occur regularly in a typical human skeleton, and so we count them. In most vertebrate skeletons, they have these bones. Well, no, let me say that again. In most mammalian skeletons, they have these bones. And so like everybody, all humans have a pisiform, all humans have a patella, okay, per wrist, per knee, okay? But not everybody has one of these. This is an x-ray of somebody's hand. And you see, look, there's one random looking bone right there. This individual, this is assuming this is somebody's right hand or left hand. Maybe it's left hand. I don't know. Getting hard to tell. But anyway, let's see. What? I can't tell. But anyway, it's their hand. They have a sesamoid bone in there. If you look at the other hand, it might have another sesamoid bone. They might have sesamoid bones at the base of both thumbs. This is the thumb, and this is the first metacarpal right there. And there's a bone there, and there's a tendon in there. This individual might have a tendon in the other hand, but might not. Might have a sibling that has the same arrangement or not. And so it's irregular. So this is a sesamoid bone. The word sesamoid means of or like a sesame seed. Because most of them are small little pieces of bone in like tendons. And the idea is that this hard mineralized tissue reinforces that tendon. You think about your knee. There's a lot of musculature pulling on this one tendon that's, that would extend your lower leg. And, your knee, right across this joint. And so it's reinforced like that. And this happens a lot in the vertebrate skeleton, where you have osseous connective tissue developing in a tissue other than, like the skeleton. Like, for example, there's a bone that's called the os penis, or it's also called the baculum. The word baculum means stick. So there's a stick in the penis. What? Yes. So, most rodents, like rats and mice and squirrels and things like that, develop a bone in their penis. Humans don't, despite what you might call an erection. There's no bone in the human penis. But a lot of other mammals actually have a bone that develops in the penis. And it's there to, of course, help provide rigidity for the penis during an erection. Humans have, when we study the human penis, there's erectile tissue in there, so we don't need a bone. But dogs, most of your rodents, most of your whales, your marine mammals, bears, lots of mammals have a bone in their penis. Some cattle will develop a bone in their heart, in the interventricular septum, just to reinforce it. So it's just kind of random developing bones. But anyway, since all humans develop kneecaps and a pisiform, the pisiform is one of the 8 bones that make up the wrist bones. We include them in the 206. But the others, you might have them all over your body. You might have them in your ankle and wrist and shoulder or wherever. But since they're variable, we don't include them, obviously, because not everybody has them. All right, sesamoid bones. So, bones of the axial skeleton. So what we're going to do, is that what this says? I can't even read it. That's what it says, bones of the axial skeleton. We'll go through the axial skeleton, we'll go through the appendicular skeleton, okay? And beginning with the axial skeleton, what are the bones of the axial skeleton? Well, you start with the skull, right? Of course, the skull, the cranial skeleton, it's comprised of 22 separate bones. Now, in human anatomy, this isn't true for all the anatomy courses I teach, but in human anatomy, they typically divide the skull, the 22 bones, into 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones, okay? Who are the 8 cranial bones? Well, I'm going to go through and define each of them and give you some general characteristics of them for lecture. Now, lab, we'll get into much more detail about the anatomy of each bone, but for lecture, I just kind of like to classify them and give you a description. Now, for your second exam, when you're going to be testing all this stuff, it's going to be a written multiple choice exam. So there's no labeling. Never in my class you're going to have to label things on a lecture exam. I mean, that's what you do in kindergarten, right? Have leaders and pointing out to stuff, whatever. We don't do that. But I've had people ask me that. So do we got to label the skeleton? No, we don't do that. Not in college. But if I give you a description of a bone, you should know where it is, how it's classified, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All whatever I talk about in the lecture. Okay. There. So there's that. I hope I got that out the way. So this is the first of our cranial bones, the parietal bone. Now, in defining it, I'll let you know that it's paired. Okay, so there's a left one and a right one. So that's 2 bones. Of the 8, this is 2. You get it? All right. The parietal bones form the superior lateral aspects of the skull. See, now I'm throwing in some of my directional terms and regional terminology and all that. See how it's all going to kind of build on each other. And so you can see the parietal bones from a couple of different views. This is a lateral view. The right side of the head. And so this is your parietal bone, forming the superior lateral aspects of the skull. This is a superior view looking down, and you can see both parietal bones meeting together right there along the midline, forming this sagittal suture. And we'll talk about sutures after a while. But anyway, that's your first bone, parietal bone. What's the second bone? The temporal bone. The temporal bone is also paired. So now we're up to 4 bones already. It's also paired, forming the inferior lateral aspects of the skull. So superior lateral aspect, now inferior lateral aspect. So down here on both sides of the head. And a lot of times, the word temporal means time, but a lot of times students will confuse it and they'll think temporal bone, temple. And if you point to your temple, where are you pointing to? Usually like right here, a soft spot behind your orbits. See what I'm doing right there? That's my temple. They go, oh, that must be where your temporal bone is. No, this is your temple. When you're pointing to your temple, this is what you're pointing. Your temporal bone, see that hole right there? That's your ear hole. So it's basically what's behind your ear, that portion of your skull right there. And this big heavy duty knot right there, that's that knot behind your ear. I know you can't see where I'm pointing for all that mop on my head, but right there, that hard spot. Temporal bone, inferior lateral aspects of the skull, which is paired. Now, next bone is the frontal bone. Here I have unpaired. So this is 5, right? This would be the 5th one. So there's only 1. Now, this is in a normal human, fully developed skeleton, okay? Everything in this class, unless I tell you otherwise, is based on a normal human skeleton. And I wonder how much longer I'm going to be able to say that without, crossing the line as far as political correctness, right? Because I'm labeling individuals. Are you calling me abnormal? Well, if you're not like what's in the anatomy book, then yes, you're abnormal. There's nothing wrong with being abnormal. Some people think I'm abnormal. Compared to you, I probably am abnormal. Whatever. Sometimes you just get that point where you're like, whatever, I don't give a shit. Anyway, normally, humans, the fully developed humans, and this is another abnormality because we define the skeleton. If you like have a textbook or encyclopedic definition of the human form, you know, male, female, you know, how big are they? What are their dimensions? It's all based on, it's something like a males are supposed to be like 6 foot tall and 155 pounds, and the females are, I don't know, 5'7" and 98 pounds or some shit like that. And like, who has dimensions like that? You know, I haven't, according to I say I'm 5'11", but I'm about 5'10" and a half. And according to the charts or whatever, I'm supposed to weigh like, 150 or 60 or something. I haven't weighed that much since I was in junior high or something like that. But anyway, so so I'm abnormal. You're just a lard ass. You're too fat. Well, okay, whatever. But anyway, I don't know how I got on this. Oh, I'm talking about this bone. I'm trying to tell you about this bone, which normally occurs. So you're going to see a lot of, the point is, things that are like, especially when you get out in the real world, and that's the reason why you're taking this class, is to learn about the human form and how things typically are. But then you're going to get out in the world, and you're going to be working with patients, and those patients have anatomy. And there's going to be oftentimes you're going to go, man, that doesn't look like it did in this textbook, and you'll see that. But this is how it normally is, like on the average, okay? Anyway, humans, when they're forming their frontal bone, you have two, but they fuse, all right, at the midline. So when you're a fully formed adult, you have one normally, and then it fuses, and you just have one frontal bone. That's your forehead bone. It doesn't just form your forehead. It also forms the superior orbits, the top parts of your eye sockets. See that right there? It's the top part of your eye sockets. And the anterior cranial floor. Look at this view. This is a view of the skull, superior view, with the Calvarian cut. They call the Calvarian. The calva, C-A-L-V-A, is your skull cap. The calva removed, or they call it a Calvarian cut or Calvarian section. Like if you perform an autopsy, they take a bone saw, make a V-shaped cut back here, and then zzz, cut all the way around, and then take off like a beanie. It takes it off, and then you can see the brain. And usually in an autopsy, they'll remove the brain, weigh it, section it, look for hemorrhages or whatever, and but this is a typical. Now in lab, we study skulls like this, and of course here's the cranial floor, and you can see that the anatomy is pretty unique. The inside of the skull, it's different than the outside. And so what you hear, this is the anterior, this is posterior, this is the right side of the head, left side of the head. It's the anterior cranial floor, and most of it, you can see, is made up of the frontal bone, okay? Except, they made a mistake in making this illustration right here. You see that? Right here. They point to this little green thing right here, and that is the ethmoid. It's a completely different bone, part of the skull. But and then they show it. It shows the frontal bone like it's closing in the back. That doesn't happen. This bone actually extends all the way out to here, and so this is a notch right here, not like a little hole. I guess nobody picked up on that. That's not a hole. It's a notch. It's actually, we call it the ethmoid notch. But anyway, we'll talk about that. This is the ethmoid bone. It kind of looks like it's shining through right there, but this is supposed to be, not supposed to be frontal bone right here where my pointer is. And you'll see that in a real skull. If you like Google an image of the anterior cranial floor or just inside the skull or something like that, you'll see that unless you come across an image like this that's incorrect. Anyway, there's your frontal bone. Now what? The occipital bone. Remember you had a frontal region and an occipital region, the front of the head, the back of the head. That's, yeah, occipital bone is basically the frontal bone, but in the back, okay? And you can't see it too well back here, but there's green bone in the back. It's just like the frontal bone in the sense that it's unpaired, although it's not paired in the fetus, okay? That's the difference. It forms the posterior cranial base. Plus, this is pretty important, I didn't add this. See it right here with the Calvarian view, the skull cap removed, you can see a lot of it right here. And then there's a huge hole right here. You see that? That opening is called the foramen magnum. And the foramen magnum is the to compensate the spinal cord, because of course this is your cranial cavity or for your brain. And your spinal cord is basically an inferior extension of your brain, and that's where it goes right there. So in the occipital bone is where you would find the foramen magnum. Now, studying the skeleton, you're going to learn a bunch of osteological buzzwords and some osteological terms that are unique to the skeleton, like the word foramen. That's singular. Plural for the word foramen is foramina, all right? You have all kinds of different foramina in the skeleton. And foramina are for the passage of something. In this case, the spinal cord. Most other cases is for the passage of things that are much smaller, like just nerves or blood vessels, and that's usually what you're going to see. And the skull is riddled with a bunch of little holes for the passage of nerves and blood vessels exiting. So it's going to be this kind of foramen or that kind of foramen or whatever. But here they call this one the foramen magnum. This is kind of a funny story I'm going to share with you. It's having this very discussion. I'm talking about a foramen magnum. And I said, what, you know, when you think of magnum, what do you think about? And I was in a lab saying this, and I said, you know, I'm trying to teach this. I just kind of asked the lab that, and I said, what do you think of when you think of magnum? And some girl in the back goes, a condom. I said, oh, what? That's okay, never mind. But it does. Magnum, you know, like a 44 Magnum, that's a big handgun. So Magnum is anything big. I guess you can have big, large condoms too. Although, I got to tell y'all something. This is another side line. I heard, I don't know for sure, but there is no difference in like larger condoms, like you can't buy condoms in sizes. That's what I heard. That's just a marketing ploy. Did you hear that? It's because if you tell people it's a extra large condom, guys will buy it, and then they don't want to buy a condom that's not large, right? If they got these kind of hang-ups or whatever. And so it's a regular size condom that just in a packaging that says it's large. And so when they go to use it, they go, hey, look at this. Man, I don't know. Anyway, so let's quit talking about penises and get back to the skull. And magnum. But the reason why I'm telling you about the foramen magnum to tell you about foramina. And also this particular one, it's the largest foramen in the skull, obviously. That's why there's the magnum. But it's not the largest one in your body. There is one other one. So this is the second largest one in your body, I guess you could say. But it's certainly the largest one in the skull, the foramen magnum for the passage of the spinal cord. Okay, now, I'm gonna move this thing. You can't see, you Zoom people can't see what I'm doing, but the kids in here can see what I'm doing. I got stuff on my screen that I got to like move around so I can see my notes. Next bone is the ethmoid bone. That's that one I was telling you that's this green one right here that's showing through. It's incorrect for your book. It's supposed to go all the way back to here. But anyway, this is the one, it's kind of, it usually gives students trouble in lab because it's very complex and it's tucked away deep in the skull, between the eyes and behind the nose, and of course underneath the anterior cranial floor. And so here I tell you that it's unpaired like the frontal and the occipital. It's a complex bony area between the orbits and in the nasal cavity. This is an unusual section. This is called a frontal section of the skull. You see the cranial cavity here. Now look down like this and you see the surface right here. That's what you're looking at right here. Okay, that's the top of the ethmoid bone. And then notice these are the orbits, the eyes. Remember the orbital regions? You can see parts of the ethmoid in the orbits here. And then right in here, this region from here up is the cranial cavity. So this space right here, that's behind your nose. Like when you breathe in through your nose, this is the passageway the air takes, okay? Like I said, this is a complex bony area, and it's kind of hard to see. Let me tell you another funny, true story about my lab. When I first started teaching over here years ago, the fall of 93. Before I came here, I guess the students, I don't know what they did in the human anatomy lab, but they didn't do what Mr. Williams expected them to do. And in my lab, I expected the students to learn all the bones of the skull. They're taking a human anatomy class who teach them all the bones. Well, before that, apparently they didn't have to know all the bones. And so there was a new sheriff in town, and I said, by golly, I'm going to make my students learn all the bones, even the ones that are hard to find. So before that didn't happen. And I told the students, yeah, they got to learn the ethmoid bone. It's kind of hard to see. It's very delicate. And like I said, you can see bits of it in the orbit. And the students were, some of the students, not all of them, I guess I had some students in there that were repeating the course. And they were taking me as opposed to somebody else that they didn't do so well in. And I said, we didn't have to learn all these little bones, last semester. That's what I wasn't here last semester. So this semester, if you take me, yeah, you got to learn this bone. And so they aggravated some students. And so they didn't want to study these bones. And they said, that's not fair. He can't ask us this. We didn't have to do this before. So we're going to do something about this. And so you know what they did? They sabotaged my skulls. I have real human skulls, human heads in my lab. And they said, well, if we sabotage the skulls, he can't ask us the questions. And so what they did is they took their pencils and they jabbed them in the eyes, and they broke all those little bones in there. So how did I learn about this? Well, let me tell you something about nursing majors. Of all the majors that are out there, there's none that are more backstabbing than a nursing major. They'll do whatever they can to eliminate their competition to get into a nursing program. And it's true. They always whisper in my ear and tell me, and they rat on their competition. Mr. Williams, you know what they did? And they told me. I said, all right, I got you. So the next lab I came in, it's okay, take out a piece of paper. They were like, what? This is when I started teaching. This is when I started giving quizzes. That's where quizzes in the lab came about, but I don't do that anymore. So I said, number one, what used to be here? I pointed to where the ethmoid bone used to be. They're like, what? You can't ask us something. Yeah, I am. I'm asking you this right now. What bone used to be here? It's not here anymore, but it used to be there. True story. Anyway, don't mess with me. So that's the moral of that story. So, ethmoid bone. And we'll look at it in my lab in more detail. But there it is. It's kind of hard to see, but I'll give you tips on how to view it, make it not so difficult. And then finally, with the cranial bones, the last cranial bone is the sphenoid bone. It also is unpaired. There's only one, although people look at it, and here you can tell it's unpaired. It kind of looks like a big bat. It looks like or a butterfly or something. It looks like it has wings or something. See how it's kind of flared out here, flared out here. Different views. You look at some different views of the sphenoid, and it kind of does look like it's some kind of flying creature. But when you look at the outside of the skull, sometimes students will look at it and they think it's like there's two of them. There's one on this side of the head and one on this side of the head, but you're actually seeing just the sides of it. But anyway, the sphenoid bone, unpaired, and I have in parentheses, it's the keystone of the cranial bones. What does that mean, keystone? What is a keystone to anything? A keystone sounds like something important, right? A keystone is like an arch, like the top of an arch, like an arch window or door or something. They have one stone at the top that kind of holds everything together. Well, that's the metaphor here is the keystone of the cranial bones, because it holds everything together, so to speak. Because we call it the keystone of the cranial bones because this bone, the sphenoid bone, articulates with all other cranial bones. You'll see there's an articulation with the ethmoid bone, the frontal bone, the occipital bone, the parietal bones, etc. And that's why we call it that. Okay, it contributes with all other cranial bones, and of course it contributes to the cranial floor. So this is basically that. And then there's the other details. You see all these little holes and stuff. To me, that's lab material. And so I know they point out all kinds of extra stuff on here. Unless I talk about it, you don't have to worry about it. But all this stuff that's pointed out, I'm going to cover in the lab. Okay, so that's that. So that's the cranial bones. Now, before we get into the facial bones, I want to share with you a little bit about parietal sutures, because we know about the parietal bone, right? There's one. That's the right parietal bone. That's this one. And then, of course, there's the left one. By the way, there's a piece of your sphenoid bone. And then you see a little piece of the ethmoid bone right there. This is a good view. It's good to study the skull from every angle, okay? Anyway, what are the parietal sutures? Well, they're associated with the parietal bones, obviously, all right? But a suture is a type of joint. And they actually have a joint chapter or a chapter in your book on articulations. And they have all different kinds of classes of articulations, and it just kind of goes on. And to me, it's kind of like overkill. I kind of talk about the joints as we come across them in passing. So here, this is me talking about this type of joint in passing and defining what sutures are. Sutures are a type of immovable joint in your body. Not all articulations have bones that move. You know, you got movable joints in your elbows and knees and so on and so forth. Those are freely movable joints, but you have slightly movable and immovable and so forth. But these are immovable joints in your skull. I know these look like random cracks in the skull or whatever. See all these little lines everywhere? Those are joints. They're formed like that. And so those joints in the skull are called sutures. And there are some landmark sutures that we identify, particularly the parietal sutures form 4 landmark sutures. Because if you look at the parietal bone, like here's the right one. It looks like a big square. A square, right? Or a quadrilateral, has 4 sides. You got 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 sides. Each side forms an articulation. Okay, and we identify each of those articulations or sutures. okay? And so I list them here for you and define them because they're pretty landmark for the skull, getting your way around the skull. The first one's called the coronal suture. Remember the coronal plane is like a frontal plane, and I said it means crown, like where you put a tiara right there. See this line right here across the front? Here's your frontal bone. These are both your parietal bones. So basically, the coronal suture is the articulation that is formed where both the right and left parietal bones articulate with the frontal bone. See, in other words, where the parietals meet the frontal right here. So this line right here, that's your coronal suture. It goes all the way across. See that? From here up over around to the other side. How about that? That's your first suture. The second one, number 2, is called the squamous suture. We've had this word before. Remember squamous? Remember epithelial cells? You have, remember simple squamous, stratified squamous, and squamous means flat, okay? Flat or scale-like. And so there's a suture called the squamous suture. And what it is, right here, it's basically where the parietal bone articulates with the squamous portion of the temporal bone. Here's the temporal bone. Remember the one that supports your ear hole, basically on the side of your head right there. When we look at the, particularly in lab, this the good thing about lab, you see more detail. But the temporal bone is what we call a composite bone. And composite bones are composed of different parts. It's usually a result of different ossification centers fusing together. And there's one big flat part right here that's called the squamous portion. Flat, get it? Flat, squamous. And then there's a kind of bony part down here. Basically, the bottom of it is called the petrous portion. Or no, this is the mastoid portion. The petrous portion is on the inside. But you'll learn all that in lab. But this big flat part here, that's called the squamous portion. And so you can see where the squamous portion of the temporal bone articulates with the parietal bone, and that forms the squamous suture, or the bottom fourth of the parietal bone, okay? So that's number 2. Number 3 is the sagittal suture. Remember the sagittal plane, it sections the body into left and right halves. And so let's imagine, running right down the middle here. You have the right side of the head, left side of the head. So this is in the sagittal plane, sagittal section. That's your sagittal suture, basically where each of the parietal bones meet each other. They meet at the midline, forming the sagittal suture. And of course, you can't really see it, but it's right here on the top of the head, right there, front to back. Okay, coronal, squamous, sagittal, and then the last one, I think this is my favorite one, number 4, the lambdoidal suture. Why is it your favorite? Oh, for a number of reasons. First of all, because I like to say the word lambdoidal. What lambdoidal means? What lambdoidal? Something that is lambdoidal is of or like the Greek letter lambda. Greek alphabet. We were like challenged to learn our Greek alphabet this past summer, right? Remember alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and all these tropical storms they're named after Greek letters. Thank goodness we didn't get to lambda, or did we? I don't even know. But the Greek alphabet, there's 24 letters. There's 26 letters in our alphabet. And the letters, you got capital letters, lowercase letters, capital A, lowercase a. They, most of the time they look different. In the Greek alphabet, it's the same thing. You got capital letters and lowercase letters. And a capital lambda looks like this. You see that? It looks like a capital A without the cross piece, okay? Or an upside down V, okay? And so there's your lambda. And at the back of the skull, you can barely see it right here. See, it kind of looks like an upside down V right there. That's where both the parietal bones articulate with the occipital bone. And this is like one side of the lambda right there. I like it. And another reason I like it, because of the Greek fraternity called the Trilambs. Lambda, lambda, lambda. Does anybody know where Trilambs are? Where did they, who belonged, let me ask you this, who belonged to the fraternity Lambda, Lambda, Lambda? Should be a bonus question. Does anybody know? It was in a movie. These individuals belong to this fraternity, and the name of the fraternity was Lambda, Lambda, Lambda. Does anybody know? You don't know? It's a movie that came out like in the 80s.
Revenge of the Nerds.
Ah, Revenge of the Nerds. They got somebody out there that's as old as me. Hey, that's when I was in college. And Revenge of the Nerds. Their fraternity they formed, all the geeky, nerdy kids, were the Trilambs, Lambda, Lambda, Lambda. It was it was a fun. If you haven't seen that, I know they made some remakes and some sequels and so forth, but the first one was the best. You know, they had some great characters in the movie. Anyway, that's another reason I like it. I might look for that movie and watch it tonight. So anyway, Lambda, Lambda, Lambda. Okay, so those are the sutures. Now, since I shared with you, this is another reason I like the lambdoidal suture, because these bones are typically associated with the lambdoidal suture. There's another type of bone called sutural bones, or the eponym is wormian. That's somebody's name, wormian. Wormian bones or sutural bones, the same thing. What are they? Well, I tell you in my next thing here, I think. Wormian bones or sutural bones, they're usually small, insignificant bones that sometimes develop within sutures. Typically, they occur in the lambdoidal suture. And what you're looking at here, this is a kind of a close-up of the apex of the lambdoidal suture right here. And then you see these random little bones in here. This is just one person's skull. And they have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra little bones in there. This person has like 5 bones right there in their lambdoidal suture, but their parents probably didn't have that number, and their siblings probably doesn't have that number, and so on and so forth. So it's very irregular. And so, but they are considered individual bones, but we don't count them in the 206 bones because not all humans have the same number. This is another illustration I hijacked from somewhere, which I think is pretty cool. It shows you 15. This is the lambdoidal sutures of 15 different skulls. And you look, you have to look kind of carefully, but you can see each of them have a different number of sutural bones kind of back in there. Now, they don't have to be in the lambdoidal suture, but most of them are. They can be anywhere else. It's this wormian bones that occur this seemingly random in the skull here, there, and everywhere. But the modern, when I say modern human skull, is typically like this. Now, a non-modern, is that a word, non-modern or unmodern or not modern? How do you say that? Primitive, how about that? A primitive human skull. So primitive when we're talking about, it's questionable whether it's human or not. When you talk about Neanderthal man, and you say, well, Neanderthal man, well, it's definitely ancient, right? I think the last ones died out like 125,000 years ago. When they died out, well, disappeared, because you ever seen the Geico commercial? That guy, so easy, a caveman can do it. that guy, he's supposed to be a Neanderthal man. You don't have people like that walking around today. But modern humans and Neanderthals, they existed at the same time. I said, were they different species? Well, no, they weren't different species. They couldn't have been different species. They were like different races. Now, there's the term race, variety, breed, subspecies. These are all the same thing. They're not genetically different from one another. The same species is like different versions of the same species. And we know this because modern humans like me and you and everybody else most of us have some Neanderthal DNA in us. So different groups of people have different amounts of Neanderthal DNA. And if you're curious, I mean, you can do one of these DNA things, where you can send off your saliva and they can tell you your history of your ancestry and your medical history and so forth, like 23andMe and what's the other one? Ancestry.com, and there's others where they can tell you all kinds of information about it. Tell you how much Neanderthal DNA you have. And it's kind of interesting because we didn't really know what happened to Neanderthal man. We were able to get some Neanderthal DNA and figure out his genome. And of course, we've done the modern human genome, so we know all the human genes. And then we got the Neanderthal genes. And then we start to say, hey, certain groups of people actually have Neanderthal genes, the genetic makeup. And so that's probably what happened to Neanderthal man. It was absorbed into the modern human population through just breeding into it. So it's like bred out of existence, so to speak. And I forget how much, but I have a certain percent. People from Western Europe have a certain amount. People from Africa have a certain amount. I think people from like Asia, I think, have the least amount, but it varies anyway. But if you compared an ancient Neanderthal skull to a modern human skull, you'd see some pretty big differences. And one of the things, while I'm sharing this with you, see, I got these random little bitty pieces of wormian bones, except look at this one right here. It looks like a pretty big single one right there. In some skulls, in some populations where this occurs regularly enough that everybody has one just right here in the center, actually they have a name for it. And so they have not 22 bones of the skull, but 23. And the 23rd bone is this one right here. It's called the interparietal bone. And Neanderthal man had Neanderthal man had an interparietal bone. And that's one way you can identify a primitive hominid skull or Homo neanderthalis skull, opposed to other morphological differences too. But there's some modern humans, obviously like this one right here, that will have an interparietal bone. We identify that. So I don't know, it's kind of interesting stuff. I guess kind of. So there we go. But there you go. So that's all the cranial bones. And there's the 8 of the 22. So we got 14 left. Those are the facial bones, bones of the face, right? 14 facial bones. The first one I list, and this is another thing too. We're going to classify axial bones, right? Bones of the axial skeleton, skull, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, In this class, human anatomy, I teach this bone as being one of the facial bones. In another class, it's not part of the facial bone because it's not part of the skull. Your lower jaw is a separate skeletal element, but not in this class. In this class, it's considered part of the skull. And your book actually calls it the mandible. See? Mandible. But that's not the name of the bone. The bone that's in your mandible is the dentary bone, and that's how I teach in all my other classes. Dentary, which means teeth. Of course, you have teeth in your lower jaw. You have teeth in your upper jaw, but this bone of your mandible or your lower jaw is named in part by having teeth. Of course, it's the portion of the jaw that has the teeth. Now, the dentary bone. The word mandible just means jaw. Lots of things have jaws. Lots of things would have a mandible. Like, for example, a grasshopper has a mandible, but the grasshopper's mandible and your mandible are two different things, right? It's not bone. It's like an exoskeleton and so on and so forth. But your jaw is like all other mammal jaws, mammalian jaws. You have a typical mammalian jaw where there's one bone in it called the dentary bone. So, but that's not true across the board for all vertebrates. So a non-mammalian jaw would have the dentary bone, one with teeth, plus other bones. Like if you look at the jaw or the mandible of an alligator, it has a dentary bone. The one that has the teeth in it is the dentary bone, but it has all these other bones in it too. And that's typical of a reptile. And then reptiles have a set number of bones in their jaw, and then amphibians have a set number, and birds have their number, and so on and so forth. But mammals, and that's how you can identify a mammalian skull. Like you digging up a fossil, and you find this, strange-looking skeleton in the skull. Recognize the skull; it's got orbits and a jaw and so forth. But is it a mammal? Is it a dinosaur, which is a reptile, or is it some kind of ancient amphibian or whatever? Well, one way you can tell is you look at the jaw. There's just one bone with teeth. It's a mammal, because only mammals have a single dentary bone in there. Okay. So anyway, this is your dentary bone, and I say that's a mammalian thing because this is not something else that you'll see in the mammalian skeleton, in the vertebrate skeleton in general. Is anytime that you have a region of the skeleton that you want to fortify and strengthen for some reason, you'll reduce the number of bones there. So instead of have a bunch of little bones, you'll have usually like one big bone, one big, strong, heavy-duty bone, okay? So you eliminate all the potential weaknesses in the form of, articulations or joints or areas where it's not fused, okay? And that's what you see in all mammals. So why do mammals do that? When you think about mammals, what do mammals do that non-mammalian vertebrates don't do? Mammals, like it's something to do with their jaw and their mouth. What do mammals do that like other animals don't do? Have you ever seen the behavior of a cow on the side of the road, driving in the country, cow pasture? What are the cows doing? If they're not pooping, what are they doing? They're chewing, yeah. Only mammals chew. Mammals are the masticators. They chew, 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 chew. Everything else just kind of grabs their food and swallows it some kind of way. But we masticate our food, or chew our food. And so you have lots and lots of muscle attached to this one bone, and it chews. And this is very important because mammals are warm-blooded, right? And so it requires a lot of energy to be warm-blooded. And so you basically, your metabolism is in high gear all the time. And so you have to maximize the amount of nutrition you get out of your meal. And so digestion begins in the oral cavity for mammals. You're masticating, so you basically turn it into a pulverized mess of stuff that can be easily broken down in the digestive, so you maximize the absorption. And so that's why mammals chew and masticate. And so to help with that, you have just one bone in there, okay, one big, strong, heavy-duty bone, the dentary bone. There you go. Lower jaw, largest and strongest bone of the skull, the only movable bone of the skull. It's true for all mammals. And not only, but other non-mammals, they could have other bones that could move besides the mandible and so forth. But this is a mammalian / human thing. Okay. All right. There's your dentary bone. Second bone. Now, again, I said the dentary bone is unpaired in adults. In a fetus, there's two. They fuse together right here in the middle. Okay. So this would be like considered one of the 14, right? Then you have paired zygomatic bones, or sometimes they're called malar bones. I think most human anatomy books call them zygomatic bones. These are your cheekbones, the blue one here, right here, and here. And you're going to see, think about it, facial bones, your face. You have a right side of your face, you have a left side of your face. You have two eyes, two nostrils, two ears. So left and right sides, a lot of the things are going to be paired. Most of your facial bones are paired for each side of your head, beginning because you have two cheeks, right? Underneath each cheek, you have your zygomatic bones. Your cheekbones, they form the cheeks and the inferior lateral margins of the orbit. So the bottom sides of your eye sockets form of the zygomatic bones. You ever heard of anybody breaking their face? I had a friend of mine. He goes, I broke my face. I said, you broke your face? How do you break your face? And I asked him, how in the hell did you break your face? And he says, walking out to his carport to get in his car to come to work. He worked here at LSU. He taught biology with me. He had kids. Kids have toys, usually toys that are not put up. And this was a skateboard in the driveway. He stepped on the skateboard, busted his ass, fell down, fell on his face, broke his zygomatic. I said, when you break your face, that's usually what you break. You break your zygomatic bone. You snap part of your orbit right there. You think about it, it's pretty little fragile little brain framework right there. So that's what he busted the side of his face right there. I broke my face. Zygomatic bone. Support your orbit. And it's part of your cheeks. All right, advance. Too many buttons to push. The nasal bones, I guess, paired. You got sides of your nose. And so these two. There's 1, 2 right there, one on each side. You can see right there. Now, most of your nose, when we study the nose, most of it's cartilage and other connective tissue, but you got a little bony part right here, forms the bridge of your nose, articulates with the frontal bone and also parts of the upper jaw, the maxilla. Okay, but that's 2 of the 14 facial bones. Of course, they're paired. And then the lacrimal bones, there's 2 of them, they're paired. Now, this is another one of those bones that my lab students from 1993 didn't want to study. This is the smallest bone in the skull. Tiny, tiny little bones. It means tear. You have tear ducts, and we study the eye, and we talk about the lacrimal apparatus. That's the apparatus associated with tear production, delivery, and removal. All right. And there's a bone named after it. In the eye socket right there, there's a small little bone. It's a little sliver. And sometimes it's hard to see, and that's why they want to destroy all that stuff in there. It's next to the ethmoid, but I made them learn it anyway, or at least I tested it on one anyway. So very small, contributes to the medial orbit. It's the site of the lacrimal fossa and foramen. And I say this, so again, so I can introduce you to another osteological term, the word fossa. And I told you what a foramen is, right? Foramen is a hole that goes through and through a bone for the passage of something, usually a blood vessel or a nerve. But in this case, the lacrimal foramen is for the passage of the nasolacrimal duct. That's the duct that drains the tears from the surface of your eyes into your nose. So if you look at a skull, there's going to be a hole right there that opens up into your nasal cavity. That's why you cry when you, let me back up. That's why you sniff when you cry. You sniff. Why do you have to sniff when you cry? Well, you got tears coming on the outside of your face, but you also have tears draining into your nose. And if you don't want to look like some kind of creature with stuff running out of your nose, you sniff. It's just part of, what you do. You're trying to pull back the tears. You don't want to think about it. You got a snotty nose, so you do that. But that's tears draining into it. You normally have tears draining into your nasal cavity all the time, but it's usually not very much. And it gets into your nasal cavity, and then just the air going back and forth, it vaporizes as just normal water vapor coming out, and you don't see it, okay? But if you're crying and producing excess lacrimal fluid, it starts running out your nose. So that's the hole. The word fossa, you see that word fossa? The word fossa means ditch. Ditch, D-I-T-C-H. What's a ditch? You're driving down the road, you got ditches on the sides of the road. What is a ditch? Well, a ditch is a kind of scooped out depression. It's kind of scooped out to allow, water to flow or whatever. Well, in osteology, in bone terminology, bones may have a scooped out depression to accommodate something. So the lacrimal fossa, you'll see, there's a depression in the lacrimal bone to accommodate the nasolacrimal sac, which of course is what is situated there to drain the tears. And you'll see there's other fossae, put an E on the end, it'd be plural, but fossa is singular. There are other fossae in the skeleton, okay? So there you go. Lacrimal fossa, lacrimal foramen, okay? Next is the inferior nasal concha, or concha. Conchae with an E would be plural, or a conch or a conch. Either way. A conch is means shell, or it is a shell. You know the big seashell thing that you put up to your head, and they say, listen, you can hear the ocean. It kind of sounds like that. Is that what the ocean sounds like? You ever put that shell up to your ear and hear it? I expected to hear like seagulls and boats and shit. I didn't hear anything like that. I just heard, I didn't know the ocean sounded like that. But that creature that lives in that big shell, is swirly and curly like that, is called a conch or a conch. Conch. So there's a bone that kind of looks like a conch or a conch. There's two. They're considered facial bones. Here I tell you is one pair of them. You have a left one and a right one of the turbinate bones. Turbinate bones. Turban means like you have a turban on your house. The whirly bird that you might have in your house. Those things that spin around on the top of the house. Those are called turbans. And turbans are there to move air in your attic, right? To keep your attic cool, right? Well, you have turbans in your nasal cavity, all right? It's not really to keep your nose cool or anything like that. Well, it kind of is in a sense, but it has to deal with air movement. And you want to treat the air that's going into and out of your body. And so you do so with turbinate bones, we have 6 turbinate bones. 2 of those turbinate bones are the inferior nasal concha, and they're inside here. There's one right here, one right here, and they articulate with the maxillae, the upper jaw bones. You can kind of see one here and here, inferior nasal concha, and they're considered facial bones. You have 2. The other 4 are actually processes of the ethmoid bone, and we'll talk about those later. And then they're called the superior and middle nasal conchae. They're paired. Okay? But the inferior nasal conchae are individual separate entities. You know, they are separate left and right facial bones. Again, the superior and middle nasal conchae are processes of the ethmoid bone. You can barely see them up in there. Like right here and here, these would be the middle nasal conchae, and the superior nasal conchae would be up here behind the nasal bones. And again, they're there, turbinate bones, to condition the air. How do they condition the air? Well, they maximize the surface area of the nasal cavity. Without these, it would be just like a hole. Your nasal cavity would just be like a big opening, like your mouth. You breathe through your mouth breather, like that. Well, that's not really doing anything to the air that's coming in, without. You don't have a lot of surface area like that. But breathing through your nose, you got all these turbinate bones that help maximize the surface area in there. And in a living skull, it's covered with nasal mucosa. The nasal mucosa is moist and highly vascularized. And so you have the vascularized moist area, it's going to be hot. So it's hot, moist surface. And what it does is when you breathe cold, dry air in, it heats and humidifies the air before it reaches your lungs. And you have to have humid air in order for respiration to work. Okay? And so we'll talk more about that later. But for now, inferior nasal concha, turbinate bones, they're facial bones in the nasal cavity right there. And I think am I almost finished? Yeah, almost. The palatine bones, they palate in your roof of the mouth. And that's not everything. They form the posterior hard palate. So there's one back here, and they also contribute to the internal nares. You have external nares here, the openings to the nasal cavity, and then these are the exiting, you know, like where the nasal cavity comes to an end back here. Those are the palatine bones. They're also paired, the left and the right one. And then the vomer. Now, if you don't include the dentary bone as part of the face, the vomer would be the only unpaired facial bone. But since we include the dentary, well, there's 2. But the vomer, it's unpaired. It's resting right here on the sphenoid, but it also contributes to the nasal septum, that partition that separates the nasal cavity into half. And then finally, you have a keystone of the cranial bone. Remember the sphenoid? Well, there's a keystone of the facial bones, and that's the maxilla. It's called the keystone because it articulates with all other facial bones, unless you include the dentary, because the dentary is not articulate with it. And you say, well, it comes in contact with it. Well, that's not a joint. When you include your jaw, close your mouth, that's not a joint. It actually, the mandible articulates with the temporal bone up here, so that's completely different. But the maxilla articulates with all other facial bones except the dentary. It forms the upper jaw and also the anterior hard palate. And of course, it supports all the teeth and the external nares right here. And that's it. And I owe you a couple of minutes, but we'll see. It'll be a week from today. Next Thursday. Today, well, Tuesday's Mardi Gras, so we don't meet Tuesday. So a week from today, we'll pick up and we'll do the highway bone. And I'll tell you more about the bones of the skull then. So we're done. Okay? So you guys have a good weekend. And be good. Happy Mardi Gras. It's a long weekend, 4-day weekend. And Mardi Gras. You want to do the country Mardi Gras, the classic Mardi Gras, or any Mardi Gras? I'll eat some king cake and drink a beer for you guys. How about that? I bought a king cake last night. Blueberry and cream cheese, my favorite. Okay. And that's it. So y'all be careful and be good. And if you can't be good, hey, be good at it, right? Okay. I will see you guys next week.